A species is a Latin word for kind or appearance, but traditionally we've used morphological differences to do so, so that sort of made sense. Today we realize that that's not such a simple concept. We differentiate based on physiology and biochemistry and behavior and DNA sequences. So there are, in this example here, at least 22 different definitions for what is a species, and it's really going to depend on what you are studying. Okay, the morphological species concept, for example, is the oldest, and researchers disagree on a lot of things because of evolutionary trends, uh, subjective criteria, problematic ideas. Morphological species concept defines a species by body, shape, and other structural features. The ecological species concept defines a species in terms of its ecological niche. The phylogenetic species concept looks at shared common ancestry. But for the most part, unless otherwise indicated, we're going to utilize the biological species concept. The biological species concept says that a species is defined as a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. Okay, the members are going to be similar to each other because they're engaging in genetic exchange, and basically gene flow is going to be linking those populations. So if you want speciation, if you want species to become different over time, speciation is going to be equal to reproductive isolation. That reproductive isolation could be due to a physical barrier, a geographic barrier, something like that. That would be an allopatric speciation. Physical limitation, and over time species become reproductively isolated. Okay, there could be some other form of barrier that comes into place, isolated due to other mechanisms other than barriers that are like physical isolation, and that would be a sympatric speciation. Now, there are other types like peripatric and parapatric, but you'll notice if you compare the diagrams that they're looking at how niches are entered, okay, and if the niches are still connected or not more than anything else. So we're going to pretty much ignore those for most of this. So species concept, we're going to use the biological species concept unless they tell you otherwise. So we haven't observed speciation, so we can't really show it's not true. Okay, basically, allopatric speciation is going to be that geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is going to restrict gene flow, and that's going to lead to an accumulation of genetic differences due to drift and sexual selection and all these sort of variables. Okay, so that's going to lead to that change over time. In the example on the left, we had fruit flies that were raised on different food mediums. Okay, and when you came back around, the overlap did not work. Okay, the species isolated themselves based off of their food preferences. So even if they are put back into the same place, isolation can become enforced through a variety of mechanisms. You could also have isolation due to genetic mistakes. So in the example on the right, we had two different species. One was a 2n of 6 and one is a 2n of 4. They both made a gamete, okay, because they were even in number. The hybrid had 5 chromosomes, so it's sterile, okay, but maybe eventually there is a mitotic or meiotic error, okay, that 5 becomes 10. It's now fertile again, and that could become a new species with a diploid number of 10. So we get the idea. These things can happen in a wide variety of ways through a wide variety of mutations. For example, bananas, we purposely bred them to be triploids so that they did not produce big seeds. But every time we need to make a new banana source or whatever, we have to go back to the seed-bearing, even-numbered bananas to breed. And we really only have 2 major species of banana that we interbreed in different ways to produce the different types of banana. Species that have some sort of barrier to gene flow, they may be allopatrically or sympatrically separated, but when those species renew contact and they're able to exchange, so this is more likely with allopatric, a hybrid zone may form. A hybrid zone is going to be a region in which members of different species meet and mate, producing hybrid offspring. So basically, isolated populations accumulate differences over time, but if they come back into contact with each other, there is the possibility of genetic exchange. Now, apart from rapid speciation, there are 3 possible outcomes for a hybrid zone over time. You could have it so that the reproductive barriers between a species weaken, causing the two species to fuse into one. That's typically going to be indicative of the fact that they haven't been separated enough to truly speciate. Grizzly bears and polar bears, for example, are beginning to interbreed with each other, producing a hybrid bear that we're calling a growler bear. Okay, will that species be successful? We don't know yet. Okay, but when hybrids are less fit than members of the parental species, natural selection is going to strengthen the prezygotic barriers, reducing the formation of unfit hybrids through a process called reinforcement. Okay. Sometimes reproductive barriers may weaken, causing two species to fuse back into one, reversing that speciation process. That would be a fusion event. Okay, the third possibility of your hybrid zone is that the hybrid is stable, okay, and begins to separate to produce a third species while the other two still exist. A long-term stable hybrid zone can happen. So there's all sorts of different options. Many hybrid zones are stable. We've been studying all sorts of species for decades, and we've found that hybridization is fairly common. And they change over time. And so, what is a species is still a complicated situation. This is why we have 20 plus definitions. If there was one definition that worked in every instance, then we would have one definition, and we have 22. Sympatric reproductive barriers that can occur. These are going to be things other than physical or geographical limitations, okay, and they come in some different categories. Prezygotic is going to be before the fertilization. Postzygotic is going to be after fertilization through the organism itself. And then the prezygotic can be divided into two sections, which is the pre-mating and then post-mating. So we can get that idea. The pre-mating attempt prezygotic barriers are going to include things like habitat isolation, okay, which means you live in different areas. So, example, we have two different breeds of bee or fly, I can't remember. It looks like a fly, and they breed on different types of berries, so they're unlikely to interbreed. Okay, temporal isolation, these two species of skunks mate at different times of the year. Okay, or maybe it's like behavioral isolation. So the blue-footed boobies, for example, have unique courting patterns and behaviors. And if they are not following those courting behaviors, they're not going to be successful in their mating attempt. Okay, if there is a mating attempt, but there is no fertilization, you have two types of separation here. Mechanical isolation, literally the reproductive anatomy doesn't work together. So in this example here, the species of snails, their shells are curving in two different directions, so they're unable to link parts, for lack of a better phrase. And then gametic isolation is going to be pretty much the same thing, but on a cellular level. Because the sperm and the egg of sea urchins and things are released into the ocean, how do they control that they're breeding with other ones of the same species? Well, there's going to be markers and locking mechanisms and receptors on the surface of the eggs and the sperm that will interact with each other. You're not going to make like a crab sea urchin hybrid. You're going to be, the sperm is not going to be able to enter the egg, or the egg will not accept the sperm, basically. Okay, if the sperm and the egg come together and there is fertilization, then you will produce a zygote. So you are looking at the post-zygotic barriers. These ones are a little more complicated and take time to study. Okay, remember that you had to produce viable and fertile offspring. So our first two barriers are going to be looking at viability and fertility. Salamanders, for example, are well known for making hybrids, but the hybrids are typically incredibly weak and they tend to die out really quickly. So that would be reduced hybrid viability. Reduced hybrid fertility, if you take a donkey and a horse and breed them together, you make a mule. Okay, but the mule is typically sterile, so that's not going to be a successful species. If you need a new mule, you're going to have to go back to the horse and the donkey. Okay, the third one really can only be seen over multiple generations, and this is hybrid breakdown. Basically, if the offspring of the hybrids lose the offspring's those hybrid traits over time, okay, that is going to be hybrid breakdown. So the first generation hybrids mate with other parent species or with each other, okay, but the next generation becomes incredibly more feeble or sterile over time, okay, that can happen. Reproductive barriers can be hard to sort of look at, but if viable and fertile offspring whose traits are maintained over time come into place, then you're likely to have speciation. What does it actually take for a species to form? The fossil record and molecular data provides information about the timing of speciation events. Paleontologists like Eldridge and Gould look at the term punctuated equilibrium to describe the pattern of apparent stasis punctuated by sudden change. But it turns out that it's not always that way. Some species change more gradually over long periods of time. Because time periods as short as 50,000 years in geologic terms can't be distinguished in fossil strata, species seem to have appeared suddenly and then linger with little or no change, but it's real complicated. Are we looking at actual data? Are we looking at limitations of our fossil record? Rates of speciation are not constant, so there can be rapid bursts of change. So it's really a situation that we need to study more on. But the two major ideas are the punctuated equilibrium with the rapid periods of change with long periods of little change, and then gradualism, where gradual changes in a particular way over long periods of time, which would more align with like Darwinian evolution. Which one's right? They're probably both right. Okay, speciation can occur rapidly, it can occur slowly. The total time between speciation events varies considerably. We've looked at dozens of plants and animal species, and we found speciation events ranging from 4,000 years in the Ugandan cichlids to 40 million years in some beetles. So this is something that's going to take more study. When you are looking at evolutionary patterns, though, there are a couple of patterns that are consistent. You have divergent evolution, which is going to be like an adaptive radiation. Think about like wolves and dogs. Okay, a number of different species have split off from a common ancestor. Over many generations, organisms evolved a variety of characteristics that allow them to survive in different niches. Why did that happen so fast? Well, we applied artificial selection to that as well. Okay, but you're also going to have convergent evolution, and in convergent evolution, you're going to have organisms that live in similar environments, producing species that have similar appearance or behavior, or both. This is basically looking at analogs or analogous structures. That similarity due to evolutionary force rather than genetic relationship. Okay, but you might also have evolution that is in parallel or coevolution when two species evolve in relation to each other. Okay, the example here is looking at these flowers in the beak of the bird. They've evolved to match their shape. Okay, symbiotic events are likely to lead to parallel evolution effects. Okay, so we get that these sort of patterns exist. Speciation is the branching of the tree. Okay, and then patterns exist within the tree and the growth patterns. But sometimes you also have to look at the loss of species. So the loss of species is going to be an extinction. Okay, extinction is a natural phenomenon that's been occurring since life evolved, but the current high rate of extinction is what underlies the biodiversity crisis that we are existing in. Species go extinct all the time. It's a natural part of evolution, but the problem is that species also come about all the time. Speciation rates are there, they balance. Okay, an extinction rate is typically expressed as a percent or number of species that go extinct within a certain period of time. For example, one extinction per million species per year would be 0.000001 species per year. If we actually look at dozens of studies over time, and we realize that the background extinction rate, or the rate of extinction that naturally occurs, is about 0.0001%. But with human impacts and increasing impacts from like population loss and habitat loss and pollution, current background extinction rates are at least 100 times higher than they typically should be. So the conservative estimates of extinction from 0.001% are now 0.01 to a full 1%. So we're seeing a great rise in threatened, vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered species in the wild. It's picking up. Now, regular extinction is different from mass extinction. Mass extinction is going to be on a much larger scale. We've looked at tons and tons of fossil evidence and ice evidence, and we found a variety of these mass extinctions. The exact number is debatable, but there's 5 that everyone sort of agrees on. And these 5 mass extinctions, in each one, 50% or more of Earth species became extinct. And they are particularly well documented, especially for shallow-watered, marine, hard-bodied animals, the organisms for which the fossil record is the most complete. Okay, and you're welcome to look more into any of these that you would like, but you're not expected to memorize what happens or what led to the extinction. But the boundaries between our geological timescales are typically based on these massive change events. The elimination is not gradual. In this sort of structural, gradual extinction occurs at a slow rate. Mass extinction occurs when a catastrophic event happens affecting the environment. For example, the Permian mass extinction that we see in the example here. The Permian mass extinction defines the boundary between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, okay, with 96% of marine animal species going extinct within that structure, 95, 96%. Okay, the Permian mass extinction happened at a time of enormous volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, with area roughly 1.6 million kilometers being covered in lava, leading to global change. Okay, the Cretaceous extinction of 65 million years ago, example, marks the boundary between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Okay, more than half of all marine species and many families of terrestrial plants and animals, including all dinosaurs except birds, went extinct. And a clue to the Cretaceous mass extinction is a thin ridge of clay enriched in iridium that separates sediments from the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Iridium is a very rare element on Earth, but is a common element in meteorites. So this is part of that meteorite hypothesis.